Hi, and welcome to the Girlfriend God. My name is Kelly, and I'll be your host. Good morning, and welcome to the Girlfriend God. Today we have Kendal Parker back with us, and the description of Kendal and all of her accomplishments and all of her accolades are in the description for the episode. Kendal's been with us before, so today she's going to talk to us about Venus. And so, welcome, Kendal. Hello.
Hi.
Do you want to start, or do you want me to just kind of rapid fire the questions that I actually have for you today?
Completely up to you, however you want to do it.
Okay. So, just for our listeners that are less informed about mythology, Venus, all the Roman gods and goddesses have Greek god and goddess counterparts. So Venus is the counterpart of Aphrodite in the Greek pantheon, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I read that in about the 200s BC, the Romans asked her for assistance in battle, and she was a symbol of Roman imperial power. So today, in contemporary mythology and contemporary popular culture even, Venus is always pigeonholed as this goddess of love and beauty. So how did we go from a goddess of war to a goddess of love?
Well, with Venus, she kind of encompassed both aspects for the Romans. For the Greeks, she was more on the love side. But for the Romans with Venus, she was strongly halved towards love and fertility and gardens and beauty and things like that, but also to bringing war and imperial power. And particularly, she was connected to the Caesars.
Didn't Julius Caesar claim her as an ancestor?
Yes.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yes, he did. He built a temple for her in the Roman Forum as Venus Genetrix, which made her an ancestor of his direct family line, and also as a protector of the Roman people and the Empire of Rome.
So she was on coinage, right?
Yes, she was.
Okay.
That was not just during Julius Caesar's reign, also many of the other Julio-Claudian emperors too.
Okay. I read that in mythological terms that that Venus is the mother of Cupid.
Yes, in some mythology, that's how she is believed to be.
And Aeneas, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but I'm not familiar with that figure in mythology.
Aeneas, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Who was Aeneas?
He is the main character in Virgil's Aeneid, which was basically Rome's version of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it took Aeneas, who was a man living in Troy when it fell, and how he goes from Troy to Italy and what would eventually become Rome. So he is essentially the founder of the Roman people before Remus came into it.
So who was the father of those children in mythology. I think I read that her consorts were two of them, Vulcan and somebody else.
Yes, Vulcan is the Roman version of the Greek Hephaestus,
Okay.
and he was her lawful husband.
Okay.
But of course, she also had relationships with Mars,
Right.
and had children with him, and she also had relations with mortals, like Aeneas's father.
So she had a lot of kids, in other
Yeah,
words,
yeah.
by different fathers.
Yes, shameful.
I know, shameful, shameful. She certainly wasn't the goddess of chastity.
No.
um, I wanted to ask a little bit about, because this is something that you might not know, is her association with the planet Venus. I don't know how much you know about astrology.
I know of her links to the constellation Pisces, but as to her connection with the planet, I've never been able to find any information about that.
So I know a little bit about astrology. I have a personal astrologer, so when I have questions, I just ask her.
Okay.
Um, what I know about Venus is that wherever Venus is in your natal birth chart, right?
Mhm.
Venus governs obviously courtship, adoration, as well as like personal tastes and aesthetics and kind of creature comforts and right things that we
Okay.
find beautiful, and kind of tangentially she's associated with wealth, which is another pleasure, right? She's like the pleasure planet. And so Venus takes 225 days to complete its orbit in the zodiac, but she's also never more than 47 degrees from the sun. And feminine energy rules Taurus and Libra, and Venus rules the second and seventh houses. And so there's 12 houses in your birth chart, and all the planets fall into one of those houses. So depending upon where she's at in your chart will determine kind of how much of an influence she has in your life. The second house is the house of value, possessions, material wealth, anything that's kind of tangible. The second house is all about how we relate to abundance and lack, and how we assign value to things in our world or in our worldview. And the seventh house is, of course, the house of partnership and marriage, but it's also kind of all relationships, right? Like familial, platonic, but obviously Venus being Venus, the emphasis is on romantic relationships. But in a broader sense, it's kind of all about, the seventh house is all about relationships in general. So that's me teaching you. And like I said, the only reason I know anything is because of Google and my own personal astrologer, my friend Rachel. So
Okay.
the only other thing I wanted to ask about was, so Venus is unique in mythology in her birth origin story, which is actually kind of gross, right?
Yeah.
My understanding is that she was already born in adult form from the sea, but she was produced by, let's see what my notes say, by the severed genitals of Caelus. Caelus, is that right? Or Uranus?
Yes.
Caelus in Greek, Uranus in Roman, is that?
Yes, I know him as Uranus, but yeah, that sounds right.
Okay. Uh, So my notes say Roman theology presents Venus as the yielding, watery female principle, because the energy of water is often associated with feminine energy in astrology and witchcraft and all that other stuff. But yeah, like can we talk about that gross
Yes, of course.
birth origin? I mean, what the fuck? That's what I have to say about that. What the fuck?
Yes, the first time I ever encountered the origin story of Venus, I thought the exact same thing. But then looking into how she was viewed in different times by different people, it kind of made sense, because particularly as Venus is viewed by the Romans as this goddess that can help them in war and peace and love and hate, I thought that connected quite well with how she was born from violence in that way.
Right.
But
I
also,
mean, they could have cut off his arm or something. You know what I mean? Did it have to be the genitals?
well, the wider story is Gaia and Uranus were a pair, and Gaia essentially decided, I've had enough of this romantic relationship. I don't want it anymore. And so she convinced one of her sons to sever Uranus's genitals so she didn't have to sleep with him anymore. He cut them off and threw them in the sea. And then from that, Venus was born.
Okay. Okay. But like I said, I mean, that is unique to Venus. I don't know of any other birth origin stories that are anything quite like that.
No, I mean, obviously, Athena was also born fully grown,
Right.
out of Zeus's head, but not quite as gruesome as
Yeah.
Aphrodite's.
So she has that claim to fame. And it's like once you know that, you can't not know it. Right.
Yeah, you're never forgetting that. That's going to haunt you forever.
Right. And just the imagery of that is, yeah. So, all right. Those are all the questions that I had. So, unlike when we talked about Kabbalah, I'm going to let you just talk about Venus, and I will
Okay,
occasionally interrupt you with questions, if that's all right.
that's
Because
perfect.
that's how we roll, right?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to talk mostly from the perspective of her as the Roman goddess, but I will bring in connections to Aphrodite where it's necessary.
Okay.
So to the Romans, Venus was the goddess of love, beauty, desire, gardens, prostitutes, and the fertility of the earth. But importantly, she was also the goddess of conflict and war. She holds sway over the desires of all living things, whether they're immortal, mortal, or animal. She is in charge, basically. Not even Zeus is powerful than her.
So that means she's in charge of all the other partnerships between gods and goddesses.
Yes, nobody is immune.
Okay. Well,
um,
that's where we get the beliefs about Cupid, right? Which was her son.
yes, yes. She has been around for about 5 millennia. And she morphed from the goddess Inanna and Astarte, which were Mesopotamian and Babylonian goddesses. From them, she's developed into obviously the goddess we know today. However, the name Aphrodite wasn't used until around 740 BCE. And the earliest physical evidence they've got of this name was in Rhodes. They found a drinking cup, and on the drinking cup it was inscribed, "I am Nestor's cup, good for drinking. Whoever drinks from this cup, immediately desire will seize him for the beautiful crowned Aphrodite." Before this time, there is no mention of that name.
That's interesting.
Yes. The name is a source of debate. Some scholars believe that the name comes from her ancestor goddess Astarte, who is also known as Astaroth, that means shining. But other scholars argue that the Greek word aphros means sea foam, and therefore the name Aphrodite came from the Greek to represent her connection with her ocean birth.
Right.
Either way, from the 8th century BCE onwards, Aphrodite and Venus as we know her today came into existence. Her chief sanctuary was in a place called Paleopaphos, which is known today as Cyprus.
I don't know if you've listened to the episodes I've done by myself, but I have a very difficult time pronouncing things like what you just said.
Well, it was believed that when she grew out of the sea,
Mhm.
the first land that she came to was Paleopaphos or Cyprus. And so this became her sacred home. She had a sanctuary hidden here that was supposedly hidden behind golden gates and decorated with beautiful, elaborate gardens. Her priestess and worshippers would go there and offer her foliage and fruits and honey and burn perfume oil and incense. As she was the goddess of life, blood sacrifice was not acceptable. But she was also quite sacred to the island of Lesbos, which was the island home of the poet priestess Sappho. Now,
That I'm familiar with.
Yes, recent studies have said that Sappho was the high priestess to Aphrodite, and she would teach young girls in the ways of worshipping the goddess and about life going forward as young women. They argue that her poems weren't actually strictly poems, but actually hymns to Aphrodite that she would sing while the young girls danced and praised the goddess.
That makes perfect sense to me. That they were hymns. I don't think that's a stretch of the imagination. I think that's quite likely.
Yes. Interestingly, also on Lesbos today, young girls reaching puberty do still dance and sing the hymns to Aphrodite like their ancestors would have done.
So the island of Lesbos is like, that's kind of like it's like the holy lesbian pilgrimage is to go to the island of Lesbos.
Yes, so anyway, this links also to Rome, because in Rome, young girls would also descend into a shrine of Aphrodite at the point of puberty with baskets holding unmentionable things. The girls weren't allowed to look at what was inside these baskets, but scholars believe they were likely votive body parts.
Also kind of gross.
Yes. But they would take these offerings down into Aphrodite's shrine, forbidden to look at what was inside. Mysteries would happen down there, and then when they came back, they were women, basically.
Okay.
So they'd go in as girls and come back as women. It was an important rite of passage for young girls.
Okay. Well, let me interrupt you to ask. So you said something about Astarte and Anath.
Inanna, yes.
So the episode that I just did about Sophia and Asherah and the Shekinah.
Mm-hmm.
So Asherah, Astarte, and Anath, those were the three great goddesses of the Canaanite pantheon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just adding what little bit of knowledge I have. Okay,
Well,
carrying
thanks.
on.
Yes, carrying on. So Venus was married to the Swiss god Vulcan, according to myth. This could be due to her connections to fire and metallurgy, which was very prominent in her worship going all the way back.
Right. And in elemental magic, fire is very much a male energy.
Yes.
Water is female, fire is male. I don't particularly like that since I like when I practice witchcraft, I said I was a fire witch. I'm a fire sign. Anyone who knows me will tell you that I'm kind of all fire all the time. I'm a lot. I'm a lot, I'm a lot.
Yes. So yes, she was married to Vulcan, but she was incredibly unfaithful. And her lover of choice was Mars. In myth, there is a story that one day the sun god Sol, or Helios to the Greeks, rode across the sky and spotted Venus and Mars together and informed Vulcan. Vulcan planned his revenge on his faithless wife by creating a magical net. It was completely invisible and he put it over his marriage bed. And then he pretended he was going on a journey. So Venus took Mars home and decided they were going to make use of him not being there. And when they got into bed, the net fell on them. So then Vulcan came back, bringing all the male gods to laugh at them, basically, and cause a scene. And they remained there until Neptune convinced Vulcan that's enough, let them go. But this obviously embarrassed and wounded Venus emotionally, and she left and went to stay at Cyprus in her sanctuary till everybody forgot about it. So just a little story of myth there. It's one that always makes me laugh.
I had not heard that story, so thank you for that.
It is said in myth that Venus and Mars had many children, including Harmonia, Phobos, Deimos, and Eros, which is Cupid. In Roman thought, Venus was the mother of the Roman people through her affair with the human man Anchises. The story goes that Jupiter, after being stung by love due to the goddess herself, retaliated by making her fall in love with a lowly cowherd. She became obsessed with Anchises, visiting him in his cattle fields on Mount Ida. She disguised herself as a Phrygian princess and approached him, robed and bedecked in flowers and jewelry. Anchises found her alluring and fell in love, but believed her to be a goddess and was very wary of, naturally. Venus assured him that she was just mortal and brought to him by Mercury to be a bride. She asked that they consummate the marriage immediately, and Anchises obviously agreed. Venus sprinkled sleep over him once they were done, and only after he woke up did she reveal herself to be a goddess. Anchises was afraid and begged for mercy, and Venus assured him that he would be fine and that she would give birth to his son Aeneas. Anchises had to say that Aeneas's mother was a nymph and never revealed that Venus was his mother. Aeneas
Why?
went
Just curious.
I don't know. This doesn't say. I'm presuming because she doesn't want anybody to know that she slept with a mortal.
And so was he like a farmer?
Yes, a cowherd. He kept cattle.
Okay.
But obviously Aeneas would then go on to found the lands of Latinium, where the fabled kings Romulus and Remus would eventually rise the Roman people. In Greek myth, Venus or Aphrodite, is connected to the star sign Pisces, which interested me immediately because that's my sign.
Oh, okay.
It is said in myth that to escape the monster Typhon, Aphrodite and her son Cupid turned into fish, creating the Pisces constellation.
Oh.
Another one of those coincidental happenings that I don't believe are coincidences, the fact that studying Venus, I found this out, and ironically, that's my star sign.
Just interesting because so in astrology, Venus is the ruling planet of Libra and Taurus.
Yes.
Just throwing that out there. That
Yeah.
that it's not the ruling. I don't know what the ruling planet for Pisces is. I'm just curious. What is ruling planet of Pisces? Neptune is the ruling planet of Pisces in astrology. I'll have to, so that astrologer friend that I have, who I call with all my astrological questions about my chart, she sent me a book, probably about 3 years ago when I was still in Pittsburgh, and it's a book about the asteroid goddesses in astrology.
Okay.
So I keep trying to get her to come on the show, and I think that would be a really interesting topic to talk about, not just asteroids, but planets in general and their association with goddesses.
Yes. Yeah, that does sound interesting. But yeah, I was interested in this connection anyway, and so I looked further into the constellation myths. And the main source for this is the Roman Hyginus, who was an Augustan librarian living in 64 BCE to around 17 CE. And he has two surviving works, one a fabulae, which is his collection of Greek myths and the connection to astronomy, and an astronomy guide that contains the fullest collection of surviving constellation myths. His work was derived from that of, now give me a second to pronounce this, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, possibly, something along
Okay,
those.
you did that better than I could.
He was a Hellenistic scholar, scientist, and poet, but he lived 100 years before Hyginus. But in Hyginus, he gives us a scientific plot of the Pisces constellation in the night sky, and then goes on to talk about the myth behind the constellation. He tells us that the myth itself is set in Egypt, and that the goddess was visiting Syria with her son. And when coming upon the river Euphrates, Typhon suddenly appeared, and thinking quickly, Venus transformed her and her son into fish to get away from the danger. But the Syrians abstained, supposedly, from catching and eating fish in this river from then on, in case they seemed to be reaching the goddess's refuge. Ovid talked about this myth in his book, The Fasti, and he states, instead of turning into fishes, it was the fishes in the river themselves that saved the goddess and her son. In Augustan Rome, Venus became a central goddess. She was supposedly the ancestor of Julius Caesar through the Aeneas myth, and Augustus was Caesar's adopted heir. In Rome, she held sway as a civic goddess of victory, statecraft, and armory. She became a goddess of virility and not just romantic desire. Caesar established a cult in Rome to Venus, known as Venus Generatrix, or ancestral Venus in English.
Right.
Connect his family and Rome to the goddess. This position stayed with Venus throughout the Roman Empire. She became the goddess of inspiration for not only the emperors, but also imperial women.
So I have a question. Was that common practice for rulers to say that they were the actual ancestors of gods and goddesses? Like, was that fairly common practice, or was Caesar the first person to do that? Or did everybody run around saying, I'm the mother of Venus, or I'm the daughter of whoever, or I'm the son of Hercules, or, you know?
I don't actually think it was common. I think Julius Caesar might have been, if not the only, one of the only emperors to do that. Most Roman emperors was just happy to be descended from Romulus and Remus.
Right. I wonder if, you know, like in movies and television, you always see like the unwed mother telling their child stories about who their father is. I wonder if all the quote unquote loose women of Rome did that with their kids. They were like, well, really, your father is, you know, whoever, some
Yeah. Like,
god,
you
or
could think that. Like, you could definitely think, I could see that happening.
bunch of Roman kids running around thinking their father was, I don't know, Zeus.
Maybe not in Rome, but I mean, look at, for example, like Achilles and Heracles that were supposedly sons of Zeus.
Right.
Like I can see Greek women like this is what happened really. So Venus became very important to imperial women. There's been marble portraits found to have become popular in imperial Rome, where they would have the body of Venus with the head of women from the imperial house.
Oh, cool.
They were often commemorative and also used as funerary monuments. But they took away the passion and sexuality of the goddess as the Greek Aphrodite and connected the women to Venus as the mother and protector of Rome. So to commemorate them as mothers and protectors.
So just another way the Romans desexualized Greek goddesses, which was fairly common.
Yes.
As we've discovered on this show through you and Carla.
So Venus remained a powerful central goddess in Rome until the arrival of early Christianity. But even then, she wasn't removed entirely. She was pretty much immediately linked into Christian belief by connection to Eve, the first woman, obviously, in the Garden of Eden.
Except she wasn't really, Lilith was, but that's another episode.
Yes. And she was also incorporated into the cult of the Virgin Mary. Not as much as Cybele was, but still there. She was tarnished into something to be seen as shameful by Christian thought, because in Christian thought, women were inferior, sin-riddled creatures.
Right.
So Christianity both made women free because it told them, you know, these Roman practices aren't right. You're not only there to bear children, you're there to spread the word of God. But it also caged them more than ever by then saying, but you are full of sin and you will do as you're told.
Right.
So Venus, as a result, was disgraced and yet she kept showing up throughout the early Christian world. The newly Christian Roman Empire temples to Venus were destroyed and dismantled and turned into chapels. But inside homes throughout Christian Rome, she was lovingly displayed, most famously by the Christian eunuch Lausus in Constantinople. He took the Cnidian Aphrodite statue and put her on display in his palace before it was burnt down and the statue lost in 475 CE. Her images also decorated Roman baths all over the empire, even to this day. Until the 5th century CE, women would ask Venus for advice before agreeing to any marriage proposals. But Christian thought kept fighting against her, demonizing her in literary texts, destroying her idolatry, and condemning her worship as demonic and pagan. Venus would not sit idly by and she would not be destroyed. She changed forms and took on the guise of the Virgin Mary, or rather, worshippers disguised her as the Virgin Mary.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
that's kind of like, it's sort of like, it's kind of an adjacent reference. So the religions of some, not all, but the religions of some Latin American Catholic cultures, hidden within them, including in idolatry and symbolism, are these much older representations of Haitian goddesses and Creole goddesses. And so you can be a strict Catholic, but still worship these, what would be considered pagan goddesses, right? So it's interesting to see how in contemporary culture that if you look deep enough, there's some other non-Christian thing rooted in the Christian thing, particularly the Catholic thing. I think I want to do an episode called "The Pagans Are Here and We Want Our Holidays Back."
I love that. But yeah, pretty much the same thing was happening in early Christianity. And there are many signs of this connection of Venus to the Virgin Mary in early Christianity. Obviously, the dove was symbolic to Mary.
Right.
And a monastery in Cyprus, of Venus's homeland, claims to have a magic belt blessed by Mary, which is visited by many women in need of spiritual aid. The monastery is known as Panagia Aphrodisia, and the whole mountain was sacred to Venus and Aphrodite before the rise of Christianity. This belt resembles Venus's girdle, which held all of her power of love. And the connection is not a coincidence. To the Romans, Venus was the protector of Rome, the protector of family and nurture of children, and this concept almost exactly replicates onto the mold of Mary. The transformation is kind of obvious. In Renaissance, Venus made a surprise comeback in her own original guise as the goddess of love. She became an obsession for women of the time and a muse for Renaissance artists like Botticelli. Religious men would condemn these artistic renderings, but Venus prevailed, and 300 years later, the Pre-Raphaelites gave her another rebirth, resulting in William Shakespeare, the 16th century playwright from England. Shakespeare knew Venus, knew the myth, knew the artworks and the controversy surrounding her, and he knew that she had something worth immortalizing. So in 1593, the first ever play he wrote was titled Venus and Adonis, and it was inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses. In his play, the
I'm
goddess...
sorry, I was just going to say, it's interesting that going back to what we were talking about earlier, if she's the goddess of all things we find beautiful, it's not surprising that she was often kind of reinvigorated by art, right? I mean, Venus is part of the Sistine Chapel painting, right? She's in there, right? Everybody thinks about that painting and thinks about just that one image of God reaching out to man, but that's a very large painting, and there's a lot of other stuff in there, including Venus. So I just think that's interesting that she's a goddess that's continually given new life by artists.
Yes. So in Shakespeare's play, the goddess hunts naked for Adonis, who she's besotted with, and very explicitly offers herself to him when she finds it. Before the culmination of this, Adonis is gored by a wild bull and dies. And the ground where Adonis' blood is splattered grows anemone flowers. A new myth gives new life on the stages of Elizabethan England. And in England, Venus's worship again became known amongst a small, well-to-do circles of high-born men. Sir Francis Dashwood of West Wycombe Park became a priestess of Aphrodite and introduced her worship into his high-ranking friendship circles and acquaintances. But as the world progressed into the Victorian era, Venus again became a thing of shame and indecency.
So I'm going to interrupt you and ask how a dude became a priestess.
That is my fault entirely. I just presumed priestess.
So really, he was a priest.
Yes,
okay.
He was a priest. He was a priest. I said priest because it's Venus and she's usually got priestesses. Sorry about that.
I heard that and I was like, how does that work? Well, I was thinking about our priests of Kabbalah and their self-castration. Okay.
So the Victorians didn't like how she was being viewed and used by men, or how they basically, through Francis Dashwood's newfound religion, claimed her for himself. So she became an excuse for misogyny and suppression and oppression. Today, she has been changed again. In the 21st century, Venus is now seen as a strong and powerful goddess. She is a sign of female strength and female power, female divinity. And in a growing feminist world, she has been reclaimed and stands tall again as a woman to be feared and revered, like she was for the Romans. She is the goddess of life itself, bringing love and desire and conflict into the hearts of all mortals, men and women alike, and is worshipped again today via pagan religions.
Right.
Yes.
Right. I mean, the neo-pagan movement brought a lot of these ancient gods and goddesses into the mainstream conversation. You know what I mean? So when you were doing research for this episode, I mean, you know what I like to bring into my show, which is your emotional and spiritual experience.
Yes.
I mean, did you have any kind of emotions about it? Doesn't it piss you off to see all these Roman goddesses that are kind of, adaptations of Greek goddesses that are adaptations of goddesses that came before the Greeks and Romans, and they've slowly either been turned into something that can be, tamed and controlled, or turned into something that's demonized and evil and sinful and all of that. You know what I mean? Doesn't that piss you off?
Yeah. It pisses me off how when Christianity comes into play in the early Christianity in Rome, how all these goddesses all of a sudden are all evil and all women are evil, and that this is all down to a select group of men that's decided this, and everybody's just like, oh yeah, we're going to believe that.
Right.
Like, it annoys me that somebody could just come in and say, this is what's happened because I've said so, and everybody's like, yeah, that makes sense, we're going to believe you.
Right.
That annoys me.
It annoys me too. I mean, because we've seen it again and again and again and again and again and again and again. I mean, it's just like, I think in contemporary culture, we think that, the patriarchal control of women started, like in the 80s with Reagan, but it didn't. It started long before that. I mean, we had, it's why people say a woman shouldn't run for president because the country's not ready for that. Well, guess what? The country is never going to be ready for that. I'm talking about us in the States, of course. You know what I mean? So it's so insidious. It's so insidious, right? Because power hides in plain sight.
Yes.
And we've lived this way for so long, we don't even notice it anymore because it is so ingrained in our culture. And at the end of the day, all of these women, all of these female goddesses were demonized because it has been hammered into the hearts of men since even before Christianity that beautiful, independent, powerful women are to be feared.
Yes.
And from that fear is born the desire to control.
Yes.
And we've been, as a human race, we've been locked into that dance for millennia, right?
Yeah.
So how do we, I guess the question is, so can we change that? And if so, how? I mean, what does that look like? Do we write new mythology?
I don't know. I think the best way of moving forward as a species is to educate and to learn. I think learning about the ancient world and their religions and their mythologies,
right,
and comparing them to later religions and mythologies and contemporary religions and mythologies, and learning how they all interconnect and where certain ideas came from is the best way of moving forward into something better. I think very much that education and awareness is the best way forward.
right. That's where I think social media is a blessing, right? Because I often say or even technology itself is a blessing and a curse, right? Because on the one hand, it makes us more separate from each other than ever before because we could be anybody we want online and never have to be authentic or genuine with people. But on the other hand, it's given us access and connection to not only information, but people all over the world.
Yes.
I mean, one of my kind of beefs with the United States is that, we tend to forget, unless we're in conflict or in war or imposing our will on, we forget that there are a lot of other countries in the world besides ours.
Okay.
Right? Because there are other cultures in other countries that still have a matrilineal focus or a female-centered faith, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that exists. It doesn't exist here in the States, but it does
Yeah.
exist.
I do believe Hindu religion is connected a lot to goddesses.
Yes. They have thousands of goddesses. I mean, they have thousands of gods too, but
The
yeah,
goddesses are still allowed to be worshipped.
yes. So there's that. I mean, and that's a pretty large swath of the world,
Yes.
right? But I just I get so frustrated being an American because we're so arrogant. I shouldn't make that as a general sweeping statement about all Americans because that is certainly not the case. But at least in the political arena, that's what it looks like, right? Like we're the only ones, we know better than everybody else. We know how things should be. And I'm sorry, but North America itself has a history prior to 1776,
Yeah.
right? And we say that we're the melting pot, but that is not reflected in the spiritual realm of the United States.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
We talk about embracing diversity, but with everything that's happened in the United States, even in the past, I don't know, 3 years, clearly that is not the case. So I don't know, it makes me angry, but more than that, I think it makes me sad, right? Like I have these, you've heard me talk on the show about, I've had a pretty big spiritual shift in the last few years. And about 2 years ago, I started to weep for humanity. That's not a thing I did before. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like now when I see, the results of wars in other countries, or, I rarely watch the news because I know that what I consume, and that includes what I consume visually and auditorily, has an effect on my balance and my spiritual well-being and all of that. I limit my exposure to the news. But I still hear about things like school shootings and I weep. I think, how did we get here? But I kind of know how we got here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much violence in our culture in the United States. And that is a very, 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 very old tale, right? To control by force and to control by violence. And, now we have what I would consider a pandemic, right? Which is the continual subjugation and attempted control of women. And that's been going on in this country and in other places in the world for a very, very long time. I mean, I bitch about the United States, but we're not, like, we don't commit female genitalia mutilation, right? Like that happens in other countries. So I guess in that regard, I should be grateful. But still, it makes me sad and it makes me weep. And I don't know. I'm glad that people that are younger than me are hopeful that we can turn it around, because I don't see that happening in my lifetime. I mean, I'm 50, so maybe in your lifetime, maybe in your children's lifetime, but personally, as someone who's usually optimistic, I'm not about the human race as a whole. I'm not optimistic. I think that she is ready to wipe us off the board and she's ready to start over.
Yes.
Start over. And I have this image in my mind of when she does that, because I think she's been doing that for thousands and thousands of years, wipe the board and start over, right? We think we're so unique, but you've probably heard me say this before. For all we know, we're like version 8,742 human. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I often think about that because obviously my studies relate so heavily on myths from different cultures, and I find reoccurring themes. And the Christian story of Noah and the Ark, I have found in Greek mythology, and I have found it in Egyptian mythology and Mesopotamia mythology. So this tells me either the earliest point was the original story and everybody else has copied, or this keeps happening.
Right. When I had my interview with C.G. Dolan and the talk that he did on the, on the fall of feminine power and the dethroning of the goddess and all of that, he talks about that. And it's like people have no idea. I think he specifically mentioned the story of the birth of Jesus and the mythology of the three wise men. That appears in many other cultures prior to Christianity. And in some of that mythology, it isn't three wise men, it's three wise women.
Oh,
So, but like as you said earlier, if we don't tell people these things, how are they going to know?
exactly.
The trick is to get people to want to know.
Yes. You have to
Right?
start them young. Like I've started teaching since she was old enough to understand. Like this
Right,
is what you're going to know.
right,
Particularly helpful during lockdowns and I had to homeschool. Like that's all we studied.
right. So a little later in the season, I'm going to do an interview with Minette Chilson, and she's one of the authors for a company called Girl God Books. And Girl God Books, like that's their whole jam. They publish children's books about different goddesses
Oh, that's brilliant.
and coloring books and things like that. And I think the woman who founded that organization she's in some faraway place, Norway, maybe, I don't remember. But that's all they do. But then, if you ask 9 out of 10 people, have you heard of Girl God Books? They're going to say no.
This
They're going
is
to
true.
say no, right? I mean, like I know other people who would call themselves pagans are interested in that. I don't know. Maybe the neo-pagans are going to save us all. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
it's the most prominent movement at least in the United States, and I assume elsewhere, that is bringing this ancient information to light. The problem then, of course, becomes the internet, if nothing else, is information overload. And how do you know what is accurate and what is true as opposed to what isn't? So I don't know. Like I said, I'm not particularly hopeful that we're going to turn it around in my lifetime, but I do believe that when we are wiped off the board, as inevitably we will be, that the next version of us will return to being a goddess-centered, matrifocal, matrilineal society. Because that's how this version of us, that's how it was in the beginning.
Yeah.
So maybe this time that beginning will carry through instead of being overridden by something else, right? Like I have this image in my mind of every time we get wiped off the board, right? She's got like I don't know, like a wise council that she meets with, and they talk about what went wrong. So I envision that this time they're going to say, you know what, the whole gender thing, that didn't really work out. Wealth, maybe we're not going to do that this time. Masculinity equals violence, maybe we will redirect them this time when they start to think that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like I said, I'm a pessimistic optimist. That makes sense. So well, thank you Kendall, for doing this with me again. And
That's
in
okay.
another couple
Yeah.
weeks, you and me and Carla are going to spend a lot of time talking about the Virgin Mary. I'm super excited about that episode.
I am too. I've been doing lots of research.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure she has too. So,
Yeah. Saying that, upon my research, I've also found connections with the Virgin Mary to obviously Cybele and Venus, but also the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet.
yes, that makes total sense.
Yes,
And there are probably others.
there probably are, the further you look. I like how I keep researching these different goddesses and they just keep coming back to Virgin Mary, like no matter who they are.
Right, right, right. Like I said, I mean, most Christians would be horrified if they knew what we know. You know, I had a job where this is a long time ago, and I'm not quite so forcing my opinion on others as I used to be.
Okay.
So, but I had a job, and there was a pretty high percentage of Christians in my coworker pool. And because I live in the Midwest, you know, so of course. And so when every Christian holiday would roll around, I would send out a company-wide email explaining the pagan roots of this holiday that they were about to celebrate. No one ever responded, and no one ever told me to stop. So I continued to do that for probably the first 5 years that I worked there. But you know what? I wasn't changing any minds.
No, but they didn't tell you to stop. So maybe they were reading and then thinking, I'll store that information, but I'm not going to tell anybody because
Right. And meanwhile, they're
understand
building a secret shrine in their house that no one knows about to
yeah,
some other
possibly.
goddess. At least I hope that's where that's how that went down. But like I said, I've grown up a little since then, and I've stopped trying to change the hearts and minds of others.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Kendall. And again, I will see you in a couple weeks,
Yes.
and
Thank you
we'll
for
talk
having
all
me.
about the Virgin Mary and more in the future.
Yes. Thank
All
you.
right. I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Hey, thanks for listening. New episodes drop every Saturday, so keep tuning in. You can also find The Girlfriend God on social media, both on TikTok and Instagram, hashtag The Girlfriend God, hashtag The Girlfriend God Podcast. Again, thanks for listening, liking, sharing, and following. The Girlfriend